Something I've really barely talked about on the channel is the fact that my humanitarian work in Laos came to a dramatic conclusion when I was kicked out of the country with death threats from government officials. She got into denouncing me face to face, standing there and screaming at me for hours as a thought criminal, as someone who was an enemy of the Communist Party, which of course I am. I mean, let's face it. Unless you're only going to recruit people to do humanitarian work in Laos who sincerely believe in and support communism. All of us are enemies of the Communist Party. She was very defensive, in a sense, about her threats to kill me. Her threats to have me put in a gulag, and my parents would never see my corpse, would never see my remains again, and so on. But she was also justifying her own threats of violence and the violence against other people that I presume she'd been implicated in herself, she'd been a part of herself in the past, in that she said at one point that she believed the government of Sweden did the same thing to its own citizens all the time too, because she had lived in Sweden. And she believed that all those Western governments, whatever, France, America, they all did the same thing. They just get away with it. But I was talking to her about that in frankly a kind of compassionate and detached way, because I could see she was really suffering. She was really miserable at this very time that she was threatening to have me killed and saying my parents would never get my corpse back for a funeral. A lot of details like this. Details about the gulag I'd be sent to and stuff, But I really didn't respond to it like a threat. I could see how much she was consumed with this sense of shame she had, probably for atrocities she's been involved in herself, but just more generally, her sense of shame for the government she represents. Something I've really barely talked about on the channel is the fact that my humanitarian work in Laos came to a dramatic conclusion when I was kicked out of the country with death threats from government officials. It's a funny story. If you tell it in a funny way, it's a really funny story. And it was alluded to on this channel a bunch of times. And then I did a really kind of low quality video that came out of a podcast spontaneously. That's the only telling of the story that's on this channel. And it's one of those things where it is my story to tell. It's like I lived through, but I'm not really motivated to tell it because it's not something that's really that meaningful to me. Melissa knows this. I'm way more emotionally burdened by, for example, my negative experience with the university system. I'm really messed up with that. And just this morning, I saw a YouTube channel from another vegan who's over 100,000 US dollars in debt, student debt, I think 150,000 US dollars in debt. The problems with the university system of education, they matter to me, they matter to other people. I'm still messed up in it. I'm still emotionally involved in it and professionally involved in it. That's the kind of thing where I feel, I want to make more videos talking about it even now. And it impacts the lives of everyone around me in this dynamic way. By contrast, the political problems that are peculiar to Laos, very few people understand, very few people care about. And I just said it can be a really funny story. I've seen people, crack up laughing when I tell the story of what happened. But I've also seen people get really upset by it, get really saddened by it. And those tend to be the people who know and understand enough about politics in Laos or politics in Southeast Asia that they see the larger tragedy that it's a part of. So the last couple of days, really just the last couple of days, I've been catching up with the politics of Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand after several years of that being quite a low priority. So yeah, compared to the average American, during the last 5 years, I've read quite a lot about the politics of Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. But, I've been learning Chinese. I was living in Kunming. I got divorced. I'm spending time in France and speaking French and spending time with my daughter. Those have been priorities in my life. Even these stuffed animals up here, putting on puppet shows for my daughter, those have been priorities and not the politics of Laos, etc. But it matters. I always feel this frustration. You do sometimes talk to people who really believe that only the politics of Washington, D.C. and Moscow and Beijing matter. And you can learn a tremendous amount about politics by studying the politics of Haiti, by studying the politics of Jamaica, But right now, politics of Sudan, we talked about that a little bit. If you think you have nothing to learn from the way political crises and political problems unfold, really all you're talking about is politics that unfold in a place that don't have consequences for the rich and the famous. That's what you're talking about, right? Yeah, sure. There could be a massacre in Laos and it won't affect people in Paris, whereas whenever there's a terrorist attack in Paris or New York City, it does. It impacts people in Laos. I mean, I've been living there when that happens. It's bizarre. I remember talking to people in Laos about how did they react when September 11th, 2001 happened and so on. I wasn't there then, but I just mean later looking back on it, because I asked them, I said, well, America is this country. They bombed every building in some provinces of your country. They completely destroyed this country. And then how did you guys feel when instead, there was this terrorist attack in the United States, and then the whole political situation changed? So, yeah, I remember also a comment from an expert, really one of the only experts on Laotian politics, who said simply and tragically, the Lao people learn a great deal by watching carefully the politics of Thailand as they unfold. And the Thai people learn nothing by ignoring Laos. And of course, for me as a Canadian, I could relate to that right away. Canadians follow American politics, or Canadians who care about politics follow American politics. And of course, Canadians learn more about their own situation in the world. They learn a lot about these important issues by following American politics. And Americans learn nothing by ignoring Canadian politics. Even the current Bernie Sanders campaign brings that into focus, where now Canada is becoming a symbol of, the possibility of a future America having cheap healthcare and cheap university tuition, providing some of the social services Canadians take for granted. I think for some Americans, Canada is also an example of a country with not as many guns. In Canada, people do own guns, but gun violence is very different in Canada. So, but yeah, you're not gonna learn from the good and the bad, what's gone right and what's gone wrong in Canada, by ignoring it. But anyway, when you scale this up globally, yes, part of the tragedy of the 21st century is that everyone is paying attention to what happens in Washington, D.C., and everyone is ignoring not just Laos and Thailand and Cambodia. It seems like everyone's ignoring really the vast majority of the inhabited surface of planet Earth. It's shocking to me. Within the last 2 years, when I've been together with Melissa, I've sometimes really been looking for any news source on China. China is not a small or obscure country. And okay, there's this one YouTube channel, there's this one podcast, there's one magazine that has a couple of pages a month. It's amazing what a low priority even China is. Obviously, if we were getting involved with politics of Africa, imagine how depressing that might be. So, yeah. Okay, another big theme. This comes up when I talk about ecology. It came up just a couple days ago talking to Melissa. The ultimate scarcity in ecology is not energy, it's not electricity, it's not water, it's not sand. What's most scarce of all is the human attention span. Human intelligence is scarce. And very often with ecological problems, what you have to face up to is, we only have so many people with so many hours to pay attention to these things. Okay? So yeah, there are many, many ways in which the politics of Laos matters. I'm going to give one link below this video to Radio Free Asia, RFA. Now, Radio Free Asia is an indirect propaganda arm of the U.S. government, but I'll give a link to their page on Laos, and you will see it's one of the only English language sources that really tries to follow what's going on in Laos. They also do this with Cambodia and a few other places, and they're doing it because the United States wants to lean on these countries to become more democratic or have higher standards of human rights. But yeah, it doesn't pretend to be an objective source. It's a pro-democracy, pro-human rights source. So it's a bias you may sympathize with, but it is a biased source for sure. Anyway, but I think honestly, if you just sit there and glance at that, you'll see, yeah, politics of Laos matters. So look, this thing happened to me. I was out doing humanitarian work in northern Laos, and I knew the rules of the game. I was never one of these ignorant tourists who thought there was no political reality outside my window. So I knew examples of other people being exiled from the country. I knew examples of people being assassinated and executed. I knew examples of people being intimidated by quote-unquote mock executions, where they act like they're going to kill you, and then maybe they shoot the gun just over your head and then tell you to get out of the country. These kinds of theatrics. And I knew about examples of intimidation where I sympathized with what the Lao government was doing, what the Communist Party was doing. They were struggling to control Christian missionaries. Again, I come from Canada. Look at what Christian missionaries did to my country. Look at what they did to the indigenous people of the country. And that's exactly what Christian missionaries were trying to do in Laos. They were really targeting the poor and the tribal ethnic minorities and the illiterate and, trying to quote-unquote save their souls and in many ways, culturally assimilate them into Christendom. And I could see the Communist Party struggling with that. Communist Party was also struggling to control drugs like opium, methamphetamine at that time. So some of the use of state coercion and violence I could sympathize with, and some I could not. But Laos was a poor, desperate, post-war country. And I just was never naive about what the rules of the game were and what the stakes of the game were. And, I'm just not that self-pitying about it in that sense, where it's like, what was it I used to say to people all the time? Worse things have happened to nicer people. I used to say that. I mean, I really was. At the time, I was laughing and smiling about it. I was very relaxed. I mean, really, I can remember hysterically laughing, And my boss in the Humanitarian Agency, he said, well, you're laughing now, but you won't be laughing. And I said to him, no, I'm always going to find this hilarious. This is always going to be funny to me. This is always going to be ridiculous. You're wrong. I remember saying to him and saying in an email afterwards, saying, ultimately, comedy is a force in the universe like gravity, where it doesn't change. This is always going to be funny. And it is funny. And it's made even more funny if you kind of know, if you were actually performing this as a comedy. I was the one guy doing humanitarian work who never slept with prostitutes. I was the one guy who never drank alcohol, who never smoked drugs. And my own boss, on this part, the white guy who was in charge of this ultimately Belgian humanitarian agency, my boss, he was drinking and carousing and had sexual relations with women of various kinds, which he was flagrantly exhibiting to me. He was much more of the stereotypical permanent vacation humanitarian professional, with all the good and the bad that comes with that. And he would get, it wasn't many times, I was completely sober, but several times he got drunk in front of me and started telling me things about his sex life. And then I was amazed when I talked to him and he was sober and he didn't remember telling me that. So anyway, I'm surrounded by these kind of more gritty, these more corrupted and corrupting examples of what humanitarian work does to white men. And I'm out there completely sober with this very abstemious, disciplined life, studying the ancient Buddhist scriptures. So studying Pali. Pali is an ancient language. It relates to Buddhism the way that Latin relates to ancient Europe or ancient Greek, whatever you want to say. But that's an ancient dead language. So studying that, then trying to cope with the modern language and trying to cope with political reality and stuff. And I was really devoted to trying to make the best out of a bad situation in Laos. And actually, by the way, part of that story was I had a long period in Laos where I really wasn't sure if I should commit to humanitarian work and research in Laos. And sorry, I'm not even getting into the research side of it. There's a lot of research also, book-based research as well as getting out in real life and seeing things. And but anyway, research is a topic for another video perhaps. But I wasn't sure for a long time if I should commit to Laos or if I should be looking at moving immediately next door to either Cambodia or Myanmar. And then I had a kind of turning point where I was like, no, you know what? This is really important. This is worthwhile. And I should really, take seriously making the best of the situation in Laos and do humanitarian work and research here, make the best of it. And then it wasn't so many months later that I was exiled from the country this way. So, part of a humanitarian project that was there nominally to feed starving people. And I signed up for the project on the basis of their original mission mandate, mission statement that described that, of literally handing out sacks of rice to starving people. And they still were doing some of that. But only after I had signed up, literally after I had read their mandate and signed the contract, was it revealed to me that they changed their mission. And again, this shows that my boss was really a very unethical and somewhat stupid guy. Like, you think this wouldn't matter to me. They had made a transition into agricultural development. And again, I was no fool. I knew just how serious this difference was. So someone who's a bit more naive might look at that and say, oh, well, what's the difference? Before, you went into villages and you handed out sacks of rice to starving people. And now instead, you're teaching starving people how to farm with better farming methods. Better meaning white Western European farming methods. Better meaning for export to Europe. I'm just saying, better meaning pesticides. Better meaning European and American cows, beef and cattle, better, the concept of better agriculture is debatable. And of course, better normally meaning the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and land ownership is taken away from the poor and given to one landowner or one corporation that's farming the cattle or farming the Western forepark. There are really deep problems with this, especially when you're making a transition from communism that had some nominal commitment to giving plots of land to all the poor people. That's part of the failure. That's part of the collapse of communism, is handing out land ownership to local people. So, without getting into that history too much. So right away I knew, whoa, this is actually a very morally murky and conflicted situation. And it was right. And they were a little bit involved also in trying to transition away from opium agriculture to other forms of agriculture. So I had a hint that I was in for a really difficult ride. And I knew also that I was going out to an area where they still very much literally had armed rebellion against the government going on. So there were guerrilla fighters, if you want to put it. I get out there. There are a million different anecdotes to tell. But the other big thematic continuity in my life is the concern with ecology. So I'm out there. I'm getting to really see the incredibly ethnically diverse and linguistically diverse reality of northern Laos. Getting to see the devastation of the American War, even the French War. There were relics from the war with the French, or the wars, plural, with the French, whatever you want to say. So it's war-torn jungle landscape, but the other thing I'm seeing is the jungle being erased from the map, step by step. So when I was up there, I was living in complete immersion in the Lao language. There wasn't a single other white man in any of those towns where I did humanitarian work, and I'm speaking and hearing the Lao language every day. So you really notice more when in your thoughts, your internal monologue, you switch from Laotian into English. When you're thinking in English as opposed to thinking in Laotian. And I remember in one of the villages, I looked at the horizon where there was a stark line between the intact forest, or forest of some kind, jungle on the hillside, and then this total deforestation, just, where there's just nothing there. It wasn't being replaced with crops being cut down. And I thought to myself in English, I bet you can see day by day, week by week, how the line moves, how this valley, this jungle valley, gets turned into a desertified valley, whatever you want to say. I remember I thought that, and a few days later, I had the same walk through town with the same view, and I actually felt emotionally devastated. I didn't weep, but I was really shocked and hurt because it was literally true. I could see that the line had moved. I could see that day by day I was watching the progress of deforestation. And I met and talked with people. Melissa's heard this before. I said to people things that they had just killed the last tigers in that province of Laos. I was doing humanitarian work. There were 2 tigers left, one male, one female, and they went out and killed them. And the justification was tigers eat people. Oh, and of course, after they killed the tigers, they sold the corpse for money to Chinese businessmen, of course. And I asked the question. This is my moment. I was speaking Lao. How
how many people did tigers kill this year? And of course, they don't know. They're stunned. The answer is probably 0. But in any given year, the number is either 0 or 1. But there aren't any tigers anymore. And I pointed at the motorcycle, and I said, how many people did motorcycles kill this year? Why don't you kill all the motorcycles? Instead of killing all the tigers. So there were all these different, really kind of meaningful thematic elements. The indigenous people and the indigenous languages and the jungle disappearing, the last of many wild species, large wild species being hunted to extinction, tigers, elephants. I didn't see it happening to the elephants myself, but I've read about, but you hear about it. Giant pythons and what have you. This is all going on. And the reality is my own humanitarian agency, in reality, sorry, use reality twice, that's in reality, it had been on a downward slippery slope from doing very legit, very direct humanitarian work to doing quite a number of things I consider illegitimate, immoral, and in many ways harmful to the local people, to their short-term and long-term future. So there was a lot to learn. And I'm out there living for, kind of 29 days a month, 29 to 30 days a month, not quite the whole month, in these remote villages where, very, very few foreigners ever go, ever have been, and so on. With all this having been said about the context that was indeed meaningful to me, the peculiar anecdote that brings it all to a dramatic ending is relatively meaningless. I've said before that I was laughing and really quite relaxed and enjoyed the bizarre circumstances of my exile. But by contrast, what I literally wept over, was throwing my dictionary in the garbage, was of seeing how many thousands of hours of hard work I'd put into Laotian language and Pali and linked languages. And, I did literally have to give away my dictionaries, my books. I couldn't carry them with me. And knowing what that represented, that all that hard work, in a very real sense, was for nothing. And of course, all the hard work studying the history and politics and history of Buddhism and stone inscriptions and archaeology, as well as modern and ongoing political history, World War II, Vietnam War. There was all this work invested into knowing Laos and understanding Laos, linked to the study of the Lao language. And that was all symbolically going in the garbage when I threw my dictionary in the garbage. So that was devastating to me. But it's in the context of this very meaningful humanitarian work that we then have this somewhat meaningless and bizarre anecdote at the end of it of how I got kicked out. So I'm in one of these remote villages doing humanitarian work, and a woman arrives who's a representative of the Lao government, and she was out there as part of U.S.-funded drug control efforts. I'm sorry. She had done projects, and she was doing projects with the United States government, but I think the specific task she was on at that time was linked to UNODC, the United Nations Drug Control Agency. In any case, her whole career, this woman, she had been to Sweden and studied and got a university degree. She'd spent time in Europe, various Western countries. Her whole life was a series of government junkets. And her current one at the time I met her was going out to these remote villages to examine and report back on, especially methamphetamine use, what was going on in the drug scene. So, and she spoke English. That was the language she'd learned and practiced while she was in Sweden. So she spoke English with me. And at first, for several days, she was trying very hard to be my best friend in the world. And she was pushing me to help write for her, to ghostwrite for her, a letter to the American Embassy. She was actually writing and trying to get the American Embassy to pay for her to do yet another junket so she could go visit, I think it was Los Angeles, somewhere in the United States. Just complete waste of taxpayers' money. But this was her whole life. I mean, she was a career bureaucrat in communist Laos. And I mean, I guess you could give her credit for saying she was wasting the money of Western countries rather than her own taxpayers. But this was really what her life was devoted to. So for several days, she and I got along just fine. And then her mood twisted. And really for no good reason, she got into denouncing me face to face, standing there and screaming at me for hours as a thought criminal, as someone who was an enemy of the Communist Party, which of course I am. I mean, let's face it. unless you're only going to recruit people to do humanitarian work in Laos who sincerely believe in and support communism. All of us are enemies of the Communist Party. I mean, none of us are part of their ideology or their religion, however you want to put it. I always thought it was significant to what happens in the rest of the story that while she was denouncing me this way, the other staff at this remote station, it's not worth describing, but it was a really beautiful and memorable setting, really bizarre setting, kind of on the edge of civilization, on the edge of the jungle. But we're in this wicker hut on stilts, bamboo hut on stilts. And the other members of staff, who were all kind of ethnic minority, born poor, tribal people, people who didn't speak Laotian as their first language. For example, there was one guy sitting there who was Hmong, Hmong, but another guy was Khmu. These are the ethnic minorities of highland Laos. So there's a real racial divide there between lowland Laotian people and the highland ethnic minorities. These other people were sitting around and laughing at her. So I actually wasn't, laughing at her in that sense. I wasn't scorning her. I had quite a surreal conversation with her about communism and her career, and I was in a kind of detached and relaxed way. I was responding to her threats to kill me, which she was going on at great length about, by really talking to her about communism, because my own parents had been communists. I grew up with communism and rejected it, and her life and how she sees the current government of Laos and how she sees it in contrast to governments in Europe living in places like Sweden. So to give an illustration, at one point, she was very defensive, in a sense, about her threats to kill me. Her threats to have me put in a gulag, and my parents would never see my corpse, would never see my remains again, and so on. But she was also justifying her own threats of violence and the violence against other people that I presume she'd been implicated in herself, she'd been a part of herself in the past, in that she said at one point that she believed the government of Sweden did the same thing to its own citizens all the time too, because she had lived in Sweden. And she believed that all those Western governments, whatever, France, America, they all did the same thing. They just get away with it. Like, you don't hear about it. Something. And you could imagine that led to a really interesting conversation between her and I, where I was like, no, like, this is really different. Like, this is actually a big difference between countries, like whether or not you get a trial, whether or not you're innocent whether or not you're innocent until proven guilty, or whether you just disappear when the Communist Party decides to abduct you, and so on. No. This is really a difference between Sweden and Laos. The quality of law and order in Sweden, and so on. No, the Swedish Communist Party is not doing this to people, nor the Swedish government. That this was really a big difference. But I was talking to her about that in frankly a kind of compassionate and detached way, because I could see she was really suffering. She was really miserable at this very time that she was threatening to have me killed and saying my parents would never get my corpse back for a funeral. A lot of details like this. Details about the gulag I'd be sent to and stuff, But I really didn't respond to it like a threat. I could see how much she was consumed with this sense of shame she had, probably for atrocities she's been involved in herself, but just more generally her sense of shame for the government she represents, the system of government she represents, in contrast to exactly places like Sweden and the United States, what have you. So yeah, it was an interesting and truly bizarre and surreal conversation that went on and on for ages. And again, these other people on the staff were sitting around laughing at her. They just thought she was completely ridiculous. So to give one other example really briefly, another part of the conversation that was strange and memorable, and again, in the midst of her making these threats to me, she started insisting that Laos was not a communist country, that foreigners didn't understand that Laos was ruled by the People's Revolutionary Party, and that they were not technically communist. And, I really responded with kind of Socratic method. And, I asked her, okay, so you have elections here in Laos, right? Right. How many political parties are there in the elections? One. You don't have elections, but there's only one political party. But really with Socratic method, I was saying to her, like, okay, so in what sense do you think you're not a communist country? Like, what do you mean by this? But I really didn't, I didn't respond to it by with fear, and I didn't respond to it by protesting my innocence or what have you. But as always, the people who really suffer are not the white Western humanitarian aid workers. It was my co-workers. So the local Laotian people, or again, whether the ethnic minority or not, Khmu, Aka, whatever they were taken in and interrogated and had to stand in front of portraits of Lenin and Karl Marx and denounce me as a thought criminal, and had to apologize to the Communist Party for the fact that they hadn't, reported me earlier. And, the punchline to it all is, what was the basis for me being denounced? And I don't think any of them ended up in prison, but probably all of them had a black mark next to their name for the rest of their lives. And, they were on the bad list of the Communist Party, whatever consequences that had for them in the communist system. What was it that led to all of this? It was the name that I gave to one of our cats. Can't say it was my cat. We had cats up there to try to keep the rats away. And I always asked them, I said, why don't you give them names? And I gave the cats names of people I respected, people I was positive about. I named one of the cats after the Minister of Ecology, because I really respected him. He was the only person I knew in the Lao government at that time who was standing up against deforestation, saying this is a real problem. We need to have a zero cutting policy in national parks and this kind of thing. It was out of respect for him that I named my cat after him. He was one of the only people in the Lao government I really liked. And she insisted on interpreting that as an insult to the Communist Party. And I said to her, in the West, when we name an animal after somebody, it's like naming a boat after somebody. We talked about this at some length. And there were other examples. And this is another reason why the other people were just laughing at her. They just thought her argument was ridiculous. Like they just thought it was completely ridiculous, the idea that this was an insult to the Communist Party. It just, that she was going to kill me for the name of my cat. To normal Lao people, even to normal Communist Party apparatchiks, it just seemed laugh out loud funny. And, I guess they were laughing until the day they were taken in and interrogated. And in terms of how bad that interrogation was, I never got to meet any of those people face to face again. But they were probably pretty cynical, well-informed people who knew how to be interrogated. I remember when I came back to the town, the employees at one of the small hotels I used to stay in. So this is in between villages. Stay in a small hotel for a day or two. They were terrified. They were terrified to see me. And of course, I soon figured out why that was. Even they had been taken in and interrogated by the Communist Party just because they changed the bed sheets on the bed where I slept. But that is part of the mania of communism, is that the country can never be pure enough. It can never be cleansed of those bourgeois impulses, because what they call bourgeois is what we would call human nature.